So our theme for this assembly is telling the old story in a strange new time. And so maybe you have noticed that our speakers, our keynote, and our speaker from Churchwide Assembly are people who work with and among those in our midst who are experiencing the strangeness and newness of the time as sort of on the cutting edge, young adults and young people who are parts of our communities and who we reach out to and who we invite into partnership in our communities. So to that end, our keynote speaker today is Dr. Kara Powell, who is the executive director of the Fuller Institute, a faculty member at the Fuller Youth Institute, and she's a faculty member at Fuller Theological Seminary and Fuller's Chief of Leadership Formation. Named by Christianity Today as one of the 50 women you should know, Kara is the author or co-author of several books, including Growing Young, a book that's well known to us, as well as Deep Ministry in a Shallow World, and many others. Kara lives with her husband Dave and their 3 children, Nathan, Krista, and Jessica, in Southern California. She prepared her remarks in advance. Here's the video.
I'm Kara Powell. I'm the Chief of Leadership Formation at Fuller Seminary and the Executive Director of the Fuller Youth Institute, and also a faculty member at Fuller Seminary. And I'm so honored that I get to think with you today and speak with you today about growing young. How do we help young people discover and love your church and churches overall? And let me just say that I'm such a fan of how God is working through the ELCA. We love staying in touch with your national leadership, as well as your regional leadership, as well as your local leadership. And so thank you for being on this journey with us as we prayerfully try to understand how to best connect with young people. Now, I love young people. And part of what I love about young people is that they're so honest. I remember when I was leading a middle school small group, and 3 of the girls in the small group came up to me. And the one in the middle, she had her arms around the other 2, and the one in the middle said, "Kara, I have a question for you." She said, "What's a prostitute?" And the girls on either side of her kind of giggled a little uncomfortably. And she said, no, wait, that's not what I mean. I mean something that we are in this church. And I said, "Do you mean a Protestant?" And she said, yeah, that's what I mean. So, prostitute, Protestant, I don't know how those words get mixed up. But young people ask such honest questions. They make such honest statements. And I remember Connor, a 15-year-old, a heavily youth grouped kid, if I can make youth group a verb, a kid who was very involved in youth group. And he said, "The only time I think about God is when I'm at church. The only time I think about God is when I'm at church." Now, Max Dupree is a beloved senior trustee at Fuller Seminary who passed away recently. One of his most important phrases is he said, "The first job of leaders is to define reality." So I'm going to define reality with you of what's happening with young people today, especially here in the US. If you look at what happens in the long-term faith trajectories of young people, the best research indicates that about 40 to 50%, or 1 in 2 young people, drift from faith and the faith community after they graduate from high school. And these are young people, these are teenagers from great youth ministries and great churches like yours. Thinking more globally beyond young people, no major Christian tradition is growing in the US today. A few are holding steady, some are growing outside of the US, but no major Christian tradition denomination is growing in the US today. Religious nuns are on the rise. They used to be 16%, now they're 23%. And by the way, I need to spell that out. That's not N-U-N-S, that's N-O-N-E-S, just to clarify. That kind of religious nuns is on the rise. I don't know the data on the N-U-N-S. If you look at young people ages 18 to 29, they represent 17% of our overall US population and only 10% of churchgoers. These are just some of the many reasons that I agree with my friend and colleague at Fuller Seminary, Scott Cormode, who says the church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. Maybe my church, maybe your church is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. And so a number of years ago, thanks to a grant from the Lilly Endowment, we at the Full Youth Institute started wondering, what if this isn't the whole story? What if in the midst of the bare spots and the challenges, we could focus on the bright spots where God is working through local faith communities, through local congregations like yours, and engaging young people? And so we set out to find amazing churches. We did an extensive nomination process. We worked through a few dozen denominations, including the ELCA, asking them to suggest amazing churches to study. From that, we did an online survey of 259 churches. We followed that up with 535 phone interviews with 41 of those churches. And then my favorite part was we did site visits. We actually went to churches, to church buildings, to congregations. We spent multiple days at 12 different, very diverse churches that are doing amazing work with young people. One of the site visits that I particularly loved was I got to go to a Latino Baptist church that, let me just say, was the most Pentecostal charismatic Baptist church that I have ever been around. And we were trying to unearth churches that are growing young. And here's our definition for growing young: churches that aren't shrinking or aging, but are growing and involving and retaining young people ages 15 to 29. So that was our age range, 15 to 29, which brings overall vitality to the whole church. And let me just say, early on in this presentation, while our research really started out to look at how churches are changing young people, along the way, we certainly saw how young people are changing churches. And that's a common theme, really, in every study we do, where we study churches and young people. Yes, we want to understand how we can be involved, loving and serving and transforming young people as God is transforming them. But along the way, we get transformed also. So grand total, we had over 1,300 interviews, 10,000 research hours, 10,000 pages of transcript. And to our delight, over half of the churches that we studied were not predominantly white. There's this amazing ethnic diversity in how God is working through churches that are growing young. And I love it when research disputes myths that we tend to think are important when it comes to certain aspects of ministry, including growing young. So let me start by naming some myths that your church doesn't need to have in order to grow young. We studied churches of all size, so please don't think it's only large churches that are growing young. We studied churches, sure, we studied a few churches that were several thousand people, but we studied a lot of churches that were under 100, under 200 people. Sometimes we tend to think a church needs to be like in an urban city center to be engaging young people. That was not the case. The only correlation between location and churches that were growing young is when we parsed out 15 to 29 into 15 to 18, 19 to 22, and 23 to 29. There's a correlation between churches that are effective with 19 to 22-year-olds and those that are located near a college. So yes, folks, several years of research. Those are the kind of groundbreaking insights that we find. But there really was no correlation, meaning whatever location or region you're in, your church can grow young. Church age, it's easy to think that, oh, maybe it's the younger churches, the church plants, they're the ones that are more effective with young people. Not at all. Sure, there were some new church plants, but we also studied churches that were over 100 years old. And then denomination, there really was no correlation with denomination. God's working across the board through Protestant as well as Catholic churches that were in the study, as well as non-denominational churches. One of the churches that I got to visit was a church in Indianapolis named St. John's. And in its heyday, St. John's had several hundred congregants who were active, who loved the church, who were involved in its ministry. But over the decades, St. John's had shrunk until it was only about less than 100 people. And they prayed about, should they shut their doors, sell the building? Was their time as a vibrant church done? But instead, as they prayed, they felt like it is not too late, the road is not too hard, and we are not too tired. We want to engage young people. And so this church that was about to shut its doors is now a church of over 1,000 people, 70% of whom are under 30. this church turned the corner and is now growing young. Now, I love telling the story of this church to show that there's no limits and God can do dramatic transformation. This was actually one of the more dramatic transformations that we studied. So typically churches made more incremental progress, but sometimes there were these amazing stories like St. John's. And as we studied these 250 churches, we were able to identify what they had in common. And we call these the 6 core commitments. We have this growing young wheel that depicts the 6 core commitments. They're listed in the order in which they are most common in churches. So typically a church will start at, let's say, 12 or 1 o'clock on the wheel with what we call keychain leadership, which is where leaders are empowering young people, handing the keys over to young people so young people can lead. Following that, there's usually a season of empathizing. Following that, there's a focus on Jesus's message. And by the way, in talking with your leaders, we decided that given time, I'm going to do a deeper dive in 3 of the 6 of these core commitments based on how God is working in your churches these days. One of those is going to be Jesus's message. Following that, there's warm relationships. And then the last 2 of the 6 core commitments are the remaining 2 core commitments that I'm going to talk about with you today. That's how we prioritize young people everywhere and how we are the best neighbors. In the center of the growing young wheel is Jesus-centered community, because ultimately that is the glue for all of these core commitments. And then I want to name what's at the outside of the growing young wheel, and that is context. Because see, I've studied churches nationwide, but I probably haven't been to your church. And so you and your leadership team, you get to prayerfully imagine, how do we take this research and contextualize it given your unique challenges, your unique opportunities, and your church's unique journey? I'll just say this though, growing young, it isn't fundamentally about only changing youth ministry. As we've been studying churches who grew young and then churches who've been on the journey of applying this research like you all are, we're realizing it's about changing church culture. So it's not just about changing youth ministry, it's about changing church culture. So let's dive into the first core commitment that we're going to talk about today of the 3 that we're going to focus on, and that is Jesus's message. Again, I love it when research can unearth some myths. And so let me highlight a couple myths that our research counters. The good news is we didn't see in our growing young research watered down teaching. We heard sermons, we listened to sermons online, we saw curriculum for Bible studies, youth ministries, young adult ministries, and let me just say, it was not watered down. Nor did churches feel like they had to offer hyper entertaining programs. No. They were quite focused on this core commitment of taking Jesus's message seriously. Now, for each of the 3 core commitments that we're going to look at, I'm going to share some research and then suggest some ideas that, again, you can contextualize in ways that really fit your particular setting. But when it comes to taking Jesus's message seriously, what we saw in these churches is it was a lot less about abstract beliefs and a lot more about focusing on Jesus. So less about abstract beliefs and more about focusing on Jesus. In the midst of the interviews we did of churches that were growing young people, said such interesting, insightful comments. And there was one young person, 120-something at a church that was growing young that took us to school. Because the interview questions, they were vetted by me and 5, 6, 7 other faculty members at Fuller. They went through our institutional review board. They had the stamp of approval of Fuller Seminary, etc. But there was one young person who showed us the flaw with one of our questions. And it was a young person who, when we were asking her, how would you define Christianity? She said, well, I'm not sure if I can define Christianity, but can I tell you who Jesus is and how Jesus has changed my life? Well, yeah, I guess we'll take that as a substitute. And then also in this interview, we had this research question where we asked her, and everybody we interviewed. On a scale of 1 to 5, how true is it that your church helps people know and understand the gospel or good news of Christianity? And she once again said, of Christianity or of Jesus? I'm going to say a 3 because of the word Christianity and not Jesus Christ in the question. And so the interviewer, a PhD student at Fuller, really very wisely had a follow-up question. If it was Jesus, would you have put a 5? And then this young person, this 20-something, not theologically trained, but nonetheless taking us as Fuller faculty to school. When the interviewer asked if it was Jesus, would you have put a 5? She said, yeah, probably. Christian is the name we give to the gospel of Christianity, but the good news is the gospel, but it's not of Christianity, it's of Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. That was her drop the mic moment. And that was really a theme in our Growing Young interviews, our surveys, our data, is that these churches and the young people who were part of them, they didn't get stuck in the quagmire of Christianity, they stayed focused on Jesus. Because Christianity can be awkward and confusing, but Jesus is always compelling. Christianity can be awkward, but Jesus is compelling. If I was in a Pentecostal room, I'd say, can I get an amen? But maybe some of you Lutherans, you're like internally amening to that. I was just telling somebody recently, if I could go back and do 30 years of youth ministry, this is going to sound kind of rudimentary, but I would talk about Jesus a whole lot more. Not God, Jesus, Jesus. And of course, I understand Trinitarian theology, etc. But for today's young people, we see this in study after study. Christianity, the church, they have mixed feelings about Jesus they're drawn to. And so as we think about how to tangibly apply this, I want to ask you to reflect on this. How and how often are you talking about Jesus? And how are you maybe undertelling the story? The good news is, from what I know about ELCA theology, your theology is steeped in Jesus. Let's just make sure that Jesus-centered theology is emanating forth week after week. And this is a good question for us to ask others to help us understand, because sometimes we're blind to ways that maybe we're undertelling the story of Jesus, maybe ways that we're focused more on peripheral issues and not enough on Jesus. So maybe this is a question that you want to have with your pastoral team, that you want to have with your volunteers, with your small group leaders, whatever leadership group that you work with. How are we doing at talking about Jesus? So that was one of the first things when it comes to taking Jesus' message seriously. These churches were ruthless about focusing on Jesus. Then the second bit of research I want to highlight with you is these churches, it was less for them about dogmatic certainty and more about authentic questions. Less about dogmatic certainty and more about authentic questions. One of the things we've seen in previous research is that youth group graduates, they have a lot of doubts. In our previous Sticky Faith research, when we asked youth group seniors how many of them had significant doubts about the faith, 70% admitted to having significant doubts about the faith. And those were those that admitted it. We think if anything, it's higher. So these doubts are happening. And it's easy to get a little freaked out, a little bit concerned about doubts. But we don't have to, because one of the other things we saw in our research is, yes, these doubts are quite prevalent, but when these doubts are expressed and explored, that's actually correlated with mature faith. Or put more simply, it's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence. It's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence. I want to tell you a story about a middle schooler named Steve. And Steve was somebody who had a lot of doubts, a lot of questions. He was part of a church. And so he went to his senior pastor one day after church, and he asked the senior pastor, "Pastor, if I raise my pinky finger, does God know which finger I'm going to raise before I raise it?" And the pastor said, "Yes, Steve, God knows what finger you're going to raise before you raise it." Well, then Steve was very bothered by starving children in Africa and all the suffering in the world. And so he pulled out from behind his back a copy of a magazine that had on the cover, "Starving Children in Africa." And he said, well, then pastor, does God know what's happening with these starving children in Africa? And the very, very well-intentioned senior pastor said, yes, Steve, God knows what's happening with these starving children in Africa, and we need to trust God. You see, that answer, it was a dead end. It wasn't an on-ramp into a deeper conversation about Jesus. It was a dead end. And so young middle school Steve, he walked out from a church that day and never again went back to a Christian church for worship. Now, the Steve that I'm talking about is actually a Steve that you have probably all heard of. It's Steve Jobs. And in the biography by Isaacson, which I read when I switched from PC to Mac, Mac is way better. When I switched from PC to Mac, I read that biography, and Isaacson tells the story. Now, there's no question that Steve has had amazing impact in our country and in our world through what he's done with technology. But imagine if that same entrepreneurial energy and vision had been channeled not just into technology, but also kingdom purposes. Our world might be a different place today. You see, Steve was hitting the ball over the net to his senior pastor, and the senior pastor didn't know how to hit it back. That's why we want to invite you and churches nationwide to think about, how do you make more space for not just faith, but also doubt? I know confirmation is such an important season, ritual, sacrament in your churches. It's been fascinating as churches, whether they do confirmation or not, when they invite young people to give testimonies, and again, this could be especially poignant during the confirmation process, is there a space not just for stories of faith, but also room for doubt, stories of doubt? When it comes to ideas that we want to offer you, how do we offer on-ramps for tough topics? How do we make it known that church is the place where we can talk about anything? Because let me just say, one of the heartbreaking realities we've seen in our research is often it's in children's ministry where the messages start to get communicated that there are certain things we talk about at church and certain things we don't talk about at church. And it's often a well-intentioned, and I keep saying well-intentioned because we are well-intentioned. It's often a well-intentioned third grade Sunday school teacher who, when a third grader comes to them and asks, why would God allow this terrible suffering in the world? Why would God allow the pandemic? Why would God allow, whatever heartbreak is happening at home, for that third grader to say, why would God allow my dad to get laid off and our family to go through financial challenges? Whatever it is, a lot of times third graders walk into our children's ministries with these kinds of questions, and the third grade Sunday school teacher usually fishes them. And as a result, that third grader learns not only that the church can't handle their tough questions, but God can't handle their tough questions. And so how can you and your church make space, have on-ramps for tough topics where young people can come with their tough questions? Some of the churches that we studied, they did, especially for those that are 21 and older, they did theology on tap. They would meet in bars. They would meet places where alcohol was served, and they would ask tough theological questions. Now, that feels like it would fit right at home in the ELCA denomination, not so much with our Baptist churches, but nonetheless, that was creative. It was going out to where young people are and being able to have a conversation. I was just reading an article by Tim Keller where he said one of the problems with the church interaction in the world today is there are no front porches, metaphoric front porches for churches where people can come and start having a conversation with us as Jesus followers out on that porch before they take the often more courageous step of walking into the building. And again, not necessarily the metaphorical church building, but the building of Christian faith. So how do we create porches where there can be space for tough topics? But then also, how do we make sure that we can ask tough topics for those who are Jesus followers? I love what some youth ministries do, where they ask young people and young adults this question: if you could ask God any question, what would it be? And I'll tell you, young people come back with such interesting insights. That can then become the teaching curriculum. That can become what you then touch on week after week, month after month. I think sometimes we adults, we're concerned or we're hesitant to ask tough questions with young people because we're afraid they're going to stump us. Well, they might, because there are aspects of God that we can't understand. If God could truly be understood, then God wouldn't be God. God would just be like a cool guy. There have to be elements of God that we can't fully understand for God to be fully other. But one of the phrases that we love teaching adults in churches that want to grow young, when a young person asks you a tough question, or any generation asks you a tough question, these 4 words: I don't know, but. Boy, that's a great question. I don't know, but how about if we get together for coffee next week and let's talk about it together? I don't know, but I'll tell you, I know a scientist who loves these kinds of questions. Let's get together with her for lunch and we can think about it together. Or it's simply, I don't know, but here's what God has shown me. Here's how God continues to change my life. So when it comes to Jesus's message, this core commitment of growing young, we want to invite you to focus on Jesus and make room for tough topics. Now let's move to the next core commitment we're going to look at together, which is the 5th of 6 in our growing young wheel, and that is how we prioritize young people everywhere. You'll notice in the wheel that there's an arrow jutting off right around 9 o'clock, if the wheel was a clock, to growing young. Because what's interesting is this core commitment of prioritizing young people, it's a bit of a linchpin. It's a bit of a fork in the road, where a church can just be a good church or a church can truly engage young people. And part of what we saw in the research of churches that are growing young is they didn't just give lip service to young people and prioritizing young people, but they made it their reality. That Latino Baptist church that I mentioned that we did a site visit at, they came across a really tough question when it came to their worship services. What they realized is that many of the young people who spoke Spanish and English, they preferred to worship in English. They preferred to hear sermons in English. Now, some of the older folks where Spanish was their first language, they tended to prefer to worship and hear sermons in Spanish. Some of them couldn't fully understand English. But the church wanted to prioritize young people. And so they actually took a vote. Should we offer parts of our worship service in English? And the adults, many of whom don't speak English fully, because of their love for young people, because they were prioritizing young people, they said, yes, we should offer parts of our worship service in English. Even if those same adults then wouldn't be able to fully understand what was happening because they couldn't understand the language, they were that committed to young people. And I think about other churches I know where, we fight over drums and we fight over a worship song if it's too contemporary, not contemporary enough. And here, this church that's growing young, the adults were willing to not understand parts of the worship service if it meant young people would feel more at home. So when it comes to prioritizing young people, let me demolish a few myths. First, it's not about having a big modern building. We studied churches that sure had amazing facilities and cafes and volleyball courts. And then we studied churches that are growing young that were meeting in dilapidated church buildings, borrowing schools or rec centers. Nor is it about having a big budget. Now, there is a budget ramification that I'll get to in a bit, but it's not about the budget size. What prioritizing young people means is it means intentionally paying attention to young people. In the midst of whatever we're doing, asking ourselves, what is it that the young people need? As Christmas is approaching, hypothetically, what if one of our first questions could be, how can young people be involved in Advent season? As we're thinking about summer service and mission trips, what if our first question was, how would young people be involved? As I told my church, which is trying to grow young, I would just love it if one of our top 3 questions when we were approaching anything, sermon series, whatever it might be, Lent, Advent, any elements of the church calendar, how can young people be involved? Very practical. Just start asking them. How do we prioritize young people? 1 of 3 questions. Now let's get to budget. Let's get tangible about budget. See, it's not about the amount of your budget, it's about the proportion. And so I want to invite you to think about this, that your budget is a manifesto of your priorities. And what percent of your budget are you allocating to children, teenagers, and young adults? How do you feel about that? Does that feel like it says that you're prioritizing young people? Or do you maybe need to tweak that? I also love this phrase from Andy Stanley: time in erodes awareness of. Time in erodes awareness of. See, our church, we actually came across that quote as we were trying to grow young, and we realized, you know what, our children's ministry facilities, they're actually not very welcoming. We're so used to them that we don't notice how unwelcoming they are. A little hard to find, a little bit confusing. And so time in erodes awareness of. That caused us to rethink like traffic flow, how to have greeters. Did we want to repaint some rooms so that they were more welcoming, etc.? I just invite you to think about your church's social media presence, your website, all the various ways that young people might interact with your church. What is all that communicating about how you prioritize young people? But then if we're going to prioritize young people, we also need to prioritize families. It's not just about young people, it's about families. My friend and colleague Pam King says that churches have become a lot like dry cleaners, that parents think they can bring their kids Sunday morning all dirty and check them all in, and then pick them up 60, 75, 90 minutes later, all clean. And who's done that spiritual cleaning? It's been the adult volunteers, the pastors who have cleaned their kids. And the reality is we want a much better and more robust partnership with parents. The best research indicates that there is no influence more important in young people's faith formation than parents. I'll say that again. There is no influence more important in young people's faith formation than parents. Christian Smith, who was in charge of the National Study of Youth and Religion, one of the most vast studies of young people and faith in the last 20 years, the way he summarized it at a panel at Fuller Seminary is he said, when it comes to kids' faith, parents get what they are. In other words, our young people are often mirroring our faith. And so as we think about how to tangibly prioritize parents, I love what one church did, and a lot of churches have done actually, where they've created training and communication rhythms with families. One church in particular, the leaders in the church decided every day we're going to pray for parents for 5 minutes. Now, we're not going to gather together, that's not feasible, but just at some point in the day, we're going to pray for families. Every week, they sent out a parent bulletin where parents got questions that they could talk about with their kids to reinforce what the church was teaching. Sometimes those questions were great after church met. Other times it was helpful before. As a parent, I love questions like that. And I love questions that I can ask my kids, especially when they were younger, elementary, middle school, say before church, because it communicated the message that the faith conversation starts at home and church reinforces it instead of the opposite. And so, especially when my kids were younger, I would make cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, unless you be under any illusions. When I make cinnamon rolls, it involves a gesture like this. Okay, so I pop open that can of cinnamon rolls, I put cinnamon rolls in the oven, and then 13 minutes later, we have homemade cinnamon rolls because I made them in my home. That's how I look at it. And either while those cinnamon rolls are cooking, or honestly, sometimes in the minivan drive on the way to church, we would talk over those questions. So how can churches give families help every week to have better conversations about what you're teaching? Once a month, how can you send a resource to families, maybe from the Fuller Youth Institute, maybe a Lutheran resource, so that they can better invest in their kids? And then annually, I love what this church did. They took an idea from the school district and they had parent pastor conferences where they invited parents to sign up for a 30-minute, 45-minute chunk of time where the pastor could talk about their overall vision for the ministry, as well as what they saw happening in that particular young person. So how can we create those kinds of rhythms? Prioritizing young people also means prioritizing what matters most to young people. And I'm going to weave in some of our more recent research on 3 big questions that change every young person here for a few minutes. We heard recently from a 15-year-old who didn't feel prioritized. This 15-year-old said, "I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking." arrow to my mind, to my heart, to my soul. I'm tired of the church answering questions I'm not asking. And so we spent a few years at the Full Youth Institute trying to understand what are the questions that young people are asking. And we landed on 3. And we summarize this in our book, 3 big questions that change every teenager. First is identity, or who am I? Second is belonging, and where do I fit? And third is purpose, or what difference can I make? Identity, belonging, and purpose. And then we wrestled with, how do we help churches understand Jesus's best answers to these questions, so that as churches and families understand these best answers, they can share them with young people. And so we did a fair amount of theological reflection. I'm going to offer our best answers. Please come up with your own. Use these as a springboard to come up with something that fits your context better, but at least you have ours as a springboard. When it comes to identity, how can we help young people? How can we prioritize young people so they know Jesus makes them enough? Jesus makes them enough. In fact, Jesus makes them more than enough. When it comes to belonging, how can we help young people know that in the midst of a world that loves them conditionally, Jesus's community loves them unconditionally, that they belong with God's people? And then lastly, purpose. As young people are trying to figure out their calling and their future, how can they know that they're part of God's unfolding story? So just put real simply, these 3 answers are enough, with, story. And as you're prioritizing young people, I invite you to think about, how can we make sure that we're acknowledging these questions and we're acknowledging Jesus's best answers to these questions. And let me just say, with my own kids who are 22, 20, and 16, if one of them is ever doing something that feels a little bit unlike them, or I go, gosh, why are they doing that? It feels askew, it feels a little bit off. When I stop and ask, are they looking for identity? Are they looking for belonging? Are they looking for purpose? All of a sudden I understand. I get it. Like, I can empathize with them, and that helps me better prioritize them. So we give you these questions so that you can be thinking even more about how you can prioritize what's important to young people. Now, when it comes to prioritizing young people, we went into this research wondering, okay, if churches prioritize young people, does that mean everybody else suffers? I mean, let's just be really practical about this. If churches give young people a bigger piece of the pie, of budget, let's say, of energy, of resources, if young people have a bigger piece of the pie, then does that mean somebody else gets a smaller piece of the pie? Children's ministry, women's ministry, missions, etc. I mean, that would make sense, right? We assume that, but as we talk to senior pastor after senior pastor, they would say, no, when we give young people a bigger piece of the pie, it's not that others get a smaller piece of the pie, it's that the whole pie grows. It's that everyone rises when we focus on young people. So that's the 5th core commitment of the 6, and the 2nd we're talking about today, prioritizing young people. Last, I get to think with you about how to be the best neighbors, how to neighbor well. One of the churches that we visited, during the research for Growing Young, we got to meet a young woman who we'll call Alexis. She had moved to Washington, D.C., where this church was located, like a lot of 20-somethings do. She was working in politics and public policy. And one weekend afternoon, she heard music and a community fair happening. And she was new to the city, a little lonely, honestly. So she went to the fair to try to check out, maybe meet some people. And she saw a booth that caught her attention. It said, "Foster the City." And it turned out it was a church that had a booth at this community fair, because the church's mission was that it would end the need for foster care, because every child would be placed, that there would be no child waiting to be placed in a foster family. Everybody would be placed. All children would be placed. And that vision was captivating to this young woman. And so she asked more questions, found out it was a church, ended up getting connected with the church, and that church has been her home since. And when we met with her and visited this church in DC as a site visit, what she said was, I love that the church wasn't waiting for me to come to them. They came to me. They were neighboring well. And so let me just say that some of the qualities we saw in churches that are growing young and neighboring well is they were courageous in embracing diversity. And let me just affirm, you on the ELCA, you are such models of what it means to affirm diversity. And I know it comes not through a social political movement, but for you, it's because of your theology, because of your understanding of scripture. And we saw this in our research too. There was a church that we were visiting in Tennessee that really prioritized racial reconciliation. When we did interviews ahead of time, the young people, the adults, they kept talking about how racial reconciliation was the DNA in the church. And so we thought, we can't wait to visit this church, see what it's like. We show up at the church and we say, well, y'all are really into racial reconciliation, right? That was kind of our posture. And they actually corrected us, including the young people. And they said, no, we're not into racial reconciliation. We're really into the gospel. And because we're into the gospel, we're into racial reconciliation. More specifically, they said this: racial reconciliation is not the goal. The goal is the gospel. The gospel is to love the people in your neighborhood, at work, and at the gym. Life change comes when your table has people who are different from you. Reconciliation is part of the gospel. So creating that big enough table and inviting diverse people early on, just as the table is being formed, to take their place. That was part of what it means to be the best neighbor. But then also hospitable neighbors that we saw in our Growing Young research, they looked for ways to neighbor well. They were serving locally, they were serving globally. It varied church by church, but they were figuring out what God was calling them to. But what's been so exciting is how churches like you have been inspired since our research to neighbor well, to grow young. There's a church in Portland that they wanted to be better neighbors. They wanted to not just be part of the community, but be a healing presence in the community. And so they reached out to the mayor of their town and said, what can we do to serve? And she said, our parks are filthy. We need somebody to clean our parks. That wasn't necessarily the answer the church was expecting, but they thought, okay, we'll clean the parks. So they ended up cleaning the parks. They ended up forging a relationship with the police department such that the chief of police came and it was interviewed at their church talking about conflict and how to work through conflict. And what the mayor said is, of this town, is no other faith community has ever reached out to her and asked her how they can serve. No other church was doing this, but this church said, we want to neighbor well. There was another church that was really captivated by this idea of being the best neighbor. And so they were looking for how they could serve. This was a church of less than 100 people. Somehow a ministry called them and that had heard about them and said, would you like to partner with us in delivering food boxes to the community, to people in need in the community? And this church of less than 100 said, yeah, we would love to. And so the ministry said, great, you need a forklift. And the church said, wait, we don't even have a church van, let alone a forklift. But God is God, and God provided. And this church of less than 100 that didn't even have a forklift, eventually within 48 hours, they found a forklift and they distributed over 1,300 food boxes. Well, fast forward, it got to the point where over the next few months, that church distributed over 11,000 food boxes because they wanted to neighbor well and they were proactive. Here's what one of the pastors said on staff of this church. She said this: there is a healing that takes place when you serve that's not available any other way. There's a healing that takes place when you serve that's not available any other way. So I want to invite you to think about, how can you become the best church, not in the community, but for the community? What does your community think of you? How can you be the best church, not in the community, but for the community? I want to wrap up by telling you one final story about one of our favorite churches that we visited, Volga Christian Reformed Church in South Dakota. The community's a handful of thousand of people. The church is a few hundred people. And if you look at the outside of the church, it doesn't look like a particularly contemporary or young church. Neither does the inside. It's pews, it's hymnals, a lot of wood. It doesn't scream young people. But there's an amazing volunteer youth leader there named Vonda. Vonda is a full-time PE teacher at the local high school, so she spends a lot of time around high school students. And she's also the volunteer youth pastor at the church. And she wanted to creatively connect the generations. And so she so wisely, when the youth ministry was doing small groups, she didn't ask families of teenagers if they could host the small groups. She asked senior adults if they would host the small groups. And so week after week, small groups came to those senior adult homes and ate together, and that created fellowship. They started this rhythm where when there was a fifth Sunday, so this happens usually about 4 times a year, they call those Bridge Sundays, and they're intergenerational services with an intergenerational potluck. I mean, a good old Midwest intergenerational potluck after the church worship service. So this church was building relationships across the generations, especially senior adults. And let me say, there's a special tenderness between senior adults and young people. And so one day, Vonda, this creative youth pastor, volunteer, said, hey, let's do golf. Let's go golfing, and let's have senior adults come and teenagers. Well, there was a senior adult named Trudy who was like an amazing golfer, and she sank this incredible putt, which caused the teenagers to go wild and forge more intergenerational relationships. When we interviewed the young people at the church, they actually remember where they felt when they started feeling like a priority. There was a church prayer meeting. They remember the Sunday when they really started feeling like they were a priority. There was a Sunday where there was a church prayer meeting, and the senior pastor asked for a few young people to pray. And the way the young people prayed captivated him and changed his own imagination for young people and youth discipleship. Now, young people at this church say things like, walking through the doors on Sunday morning is the best. As graduating seniors pray about what they're going to do after graduation, their church and whether they're willing to leave their church is a factor in their decision. And again, not only are young people being changed, but the whole church is being changed. ELCA friends, thank you for your heart for young people. And may God give you wisdom to know the steps you can take that, again, will change young people and help young people change your church. Thanks.